All right, so for the final portion of our lecture, we're going to take a look at EBB's husband, Robert Browning, who was an odd but really interesting poet, and like her, one of my all-time favorites. Um, Again, he was homeschooled mainly. He did have some experiences at university, but he preferred to actually have his education at home. And his father was a banker and not necessarily interested in literature and writing the way Browning was, but they were well to do enough. They had an extensive library, and so Browning just read and read and read, which, as you see, is a common theme of these writers. To be a great writer, you have to read a lot of literature. Um, His first poem, Pauline, was what we call confessional poetry, very personal poetry. And it didn't necessarily receive negative reviews, but critics pointed out how clearly personal this poem was. And so he didn't like that. And so from that point on, it was this really interesting perspective. He tried to distance himself from his poetry as much as possible and not make it personal. To try to do this, for 10 years, he wrote plays, but none of them were successful. What's interesting about his playwriting, though, is he got very good at writing dialogue, and he invented the dramatic monologue. So once he went back to poetry, his poems really were these long dialogues. And so the skills he gained writing plays, even though his plays weren't successful, helped prepare him for what he would do as a poet, which was such an accomplishment. And so he was initially not as famous as Elizabeth. People thought he was kind of odd, and his poems were not super popular. Um, but eventually, later in life, people slowly began to appreciate him, and he eventually became seen as a rival to Tennyson. Not that they were opposed to each other, but that his poetry was of the caliber of Tennyson's. Um, he never became poet laureate or anything, but this is still a big accomplishment. I really think it is. He's kind of odd, but I like odd things, and so I think I almost like him more than Tennyson. Um, they both really thrived during those 15 years they had together in Italy. You can really see this couple as they had this beautiful love story, and they really, even though they only had 15 years together, that's still a good chunk of time, and they really both did their best work during that time. She got healthy, they had a son, and then like I said, a lot of his poetry wasn't received well, but he produced his best poetry during that time. And his 1855 collection, Men and Women, have includes some of his most famous poems, including both Love Among the Ruins and Child Roll into the Dark Came, which are my two favorite poems of his and are included in our reading for this lesson. After Elizabeth died in 1861, he returned to London with their son Penn, and really became part of the literary circles there. Liked to get to know the other writers of the day, and wrote pretty prolifically for the rest of his life. He lived a long time. He lived until 1889, so another 28 years. A few years later, in 1868, he composed The Ring and the Book, which is a long narrative poem. Um, it's one of the longest, it may be the longest or the second longest poem in the English language. It's longer than Paradise Lost. It's incredibly long. He collected things, and he found this manuscript, not a manuscript, these proceedings from a court case in Italy from, I think, 400 or 500 years earlier about a husband who murdered his wife. And so, much like the Duke in My Last Duchess, he portrayed um, this disastrous, murderous relationship. But it's so long, he represents all kinds of perspectives, both the husband and the wife. I've always wanted to read this. I've never had the chance, but it sounds fascinating. As we learn more about Browning, I think you'll see why. And then he was buried in Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey in 1889. So, honored for his poetic achievements. All right. Before we dive into the poems, I want to talk a little bit about just what the dramatic monologue is and how we read it and why it's so important. So, in its most simplest definition, it's a poem that presents itself as the speech of a created character. So there's a big distance here between the poet and the speaker. The character will often be a literary character or a historical figure, like the Duke. Sometimes it'll be an invented character like Porphyria's lover, but sometimes it'll be a real person like the Duke in My Last Duchess. Um, but poetry is interesting because we always have this dramatic context of a speaker and a listener. And the speaker often can be the poet, though we should never assume it's the poet. But in the majority of poetry, there's a connection, a closeness between the speaker and the poet, even if they're not the same individual. Whereas with the dramatic monologue, that completely changes. There's a great distance between the two. So much so, well, now, I should say first, before I make my next comment, I'm sorry that Browning invented the dramatic monologue, but he has his own specific style of dramatic monologue. And there are variations of it that don't necessarily follow his style. In fact, most of the poems we read in this lesson, I think all of them except In Memoriam, were dramatic monologues where you have Ulysses speaking or the slave mother speaking in the last poem we looked at. And, and so there are variations, but for Browning, there's a huge distinction, a huge distance between the speaker and the poet. And so to get the meaning of the poem, there's almost like another layer of interpretation that's not there in other poems. The poems are always difficult to interpret, but Browning's poems, because they're dramatic monologues, you can almost never read them at face value. You can't take what the speaker is saying um, as reliable because they're often unreliable narrators. In most of Browning's poems, they are. So to understand that there's this second degree of interpretation. So first you have to interpret the words. Then you have to look at the historical or literary context, figure out who the speaker is, can we trust them? And then in that context, interpret it. Figure out what the distance is between the speaker and the poet. Is the speaker a hero, a villain, or whatnot? And then determine what the poet's really trying to say, what the message or theme of the work is. And so it makes the reading more complicated, but many readers, including myself, find this very appealing. A lot of comparisons have been made between Robert Browning and my favorite poet, John Donne, because Donne wrote these complicated, difficult to interpret poems and often sacrificed the beauty of the language for um, making the poem more of a puzzle for readers to interpret. And so Browning similarly makes his poems difficult to interpret, and the language isn't always as beautiful as, say, in like Tennyson, but someone like me personally, I prefer that kind of mental challenge, and the poetry is really fun to read. So this is part of what makes Browning odd and why he wasn't initially appreciated, but eventually people worked through the puzzles of the poems and saw the brilliance that was there. And so you may or may not like this based on your own personal preferences, but it's definitely um, interesting and worth studying. And the dramatic monologue is still a style of poetry that's used today. And one last point is we may also need to interpret what the poet thinks of the speaker he has created. So as we go through these layers of interpretation and learn more about the speaker, learn more about the context, learn more about the connection or lack thereof between the speaker and poet, we have to ask, does the poet approve of the speaker? Does the poet agree with what the speaker is saying? Um, so this makes the interpretation, the act of interpretation, really interesting, if you ask. So first we're going to look at Porphyria's lover. We're going to look at 3 out of the 4 poems I assigned, and I believe they get more difficult to interpret as we go. And so we'll learn Browning's method and ideally get better and interpret more and more complex poems as we go. But I really like Porphyria's lover as an introduction to Browning because I think it's the easiest to interpret of his more famous poems, and it really clearly outlines in a very straightforward way how the dramatic monologue works, the way I just described on the previous slide. So if you look at a set of lines early on, the speaker says, "She put my arm about her waist and made her smooth white shoulder bare, and all her yellow hair displaced, and stooping made my cheek lie there, and spread o'er all her yellow hair, murmuring how she loved me, she, too weak for all her heart's endeavor, to set its struggling passion free, from pride and vainer ties to sever, and give herself to me forever. So the first time I ever read this poem, I was reading it. It was very interesting. I thought, this is a romance. These two individuals are about to have this perhaps forbidden, but this romantic encounter. Yet it's kind of creepy, isn't it? Even as we read this part where he says, and give herself to me forever. Um, you almost get the sense that he wants to control or possess her here. And so it seems like it's about romance, but there's this very subtle foreboding tone. And that only deepens as we go. And then that next line's not much farther down. He says, be sure I looked up at her eyes, happy and proud at last I knew. Porphyria worshipped me, surprise, made my heart swell, and still it grew when I debated what to do. And so I think the key phrase here is Porphyria worshipped me. That's what he's wanted all along, and it shows again this desire to control her. Um, well, he says I debated what to do. Again, the easy way to interpret that, the way I interpreted that when I first read it, is should he return her love or not? But it actually foreshadows the twist that's coming. So the first time I read this poem, I was reading it thinking this was a romance. And I was completely shocked when in lines 36 to 42 he says, that moment she was mine, mine fair, perfectly pure and good I found, a thing to do, in all her hair, and one long yellow string I wound, 3 times her little throat around, and strangled her. No pain she felt, I am quite sure she felt no pain. So about halfway through we have this break where now all of a sudden it's a poem about murder, which we didn't expect. And so this is very typical of Browning. He has these poems like My Last Duchess, like The Ring in the Book, where you have men murdering women, and it's quite brutal. But he's actually making, as we'll see in My Last Duchess, an important point that's actually very supportive of women. And that's where you have that distance between the speaker and the poet and the dramatic monologue. And he says, and thus we sit together now. Sorry, these are the very last lines of the poem. And thus we sit together now, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. So you have this scene where he's just killed this woman, and now he's sitting there very creepily next to her all night, and he says, God has not overseen any of it. So if you take this at face value, it sounds like a crisis in faith moment. It sounds like the most doubtful parts of In Memoriam. Um, but you can't take it at face value because you have to think about who the speaker is. And so this poem was originally published as part of a collection called Madhouse Calls. And so the speaker here is supposed to be insane. So if we know it's part of a collection called Madhouse Calls, we know we cannot trust the speaker. The speaker is not reliable. The speaker is insane. And so while it seems like Browning is saying God is not a parent, he's actually saying God is a parent. Only a crazy person would say God is not a parent. And so he's critiquing the speaker here. Like we said, we have to interpret the poem, figure out who the speaker is, figure out what the poet's actually trying to say by using that kind of speaker, and then come to a conclusion. And that conclusion often involves a judgment by this poet of the speaker. And so here Browning's clearly critiquing the sexual violence of the speaker and critiquing this insane um, speaker. And so much violence was perpetrated against women in the Victorian period. And so by presenting this ironic situation, Browning's actually in a way standing up for women, which becomes even more apparent in My Last Duchess. So this poem, Porphyria's Lover, I think is fairly easy to interpret despite it being a dramatic monologue because you have the very clear twist from romance to murder and then the very clear indication that the speaker cannot be trusted. My Duchess, which is probably Browning's most famous poem, is a little more difficult to interpret, but something very similar is happening. So this is a real thing that happened, is loosely based on a true story where this Italian duke, a few hundred years before Browning wrote the poem, um, killed his wife, and in the context of the poem, that's already happened, and he's now meeting an emissary trying to negotiate his next marriage. And when he shows the emissary the painting of his previous wife, he says, "And seemed as if they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there, so not the first. Are you to turn and ask thus, sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek." So the painting, she has these flushed cheeks, and he's basically saying it's not just my presence that made her cheeks flush, it's the presence of other men too. So he's accusing his deceased wife of infidelity, claiming she was unfaithful. But I picked these set of lines because it's the first time he says that. But if you read the whole poem, which isn't that long for a dramatic monologue, he says this over and over again. And something you've probably observed about human nature, like I have, is that if someone says something over and over again, they're trying to convince themselves and other people it's true. And so as we read in between the lines here, we start to see that the Duke is, maybe his wife wasn't actually unfaithful, or certainly not as many times as he claims. Probably many of these um, um, many of these liaisons were invented in his mind. And so we start to see we probably can't trust the Duke. He's probably, it sounds like, paranoid and jealous. Uh, Go on, we find out what happens. And he says, "Whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile, this grew I gave commands, then all the smiles stopped together. There she stands as if alive, will't please you rise." So he had her killed. Basically, all the smiles stopped. And so, what do we learn from this? Well, Browning clearly portrays the Duke as an unreliable narrator because he's paranoid and jealous. So we can't trust what he says. So she probably was not unfaithful, or at least not to the degree which he claims. Um, and the poem has this beautiful language that kind of goes along with the art. But the art actually depicts this beautiful language, but the art actually depicts this deplorable crime, this awful thing the Duke did, having his wife murdered. And so there's this juxtaposition, there's this irony, and again, Browning is critiquing, judging the speaker, casting him as a villain. So why do this? So through this ironic portrayal, what Browning critiques is Victorian efforts to control and contain and police sexual behavior. The Duke is this corrupt man, but he sees his wife inaccurately, and he sees her as immoral. And the Victorian period, as I mentioned, was one of sweeping change and instability in response to that great efforts to try to make things more stable. So the government, the policies during the Victorian time were very much focused on shaping individuals' lives, and the government was very much trying as much as possible to directly intervene in the lives of individuals and control them as much as possible. And so there wasn't much freedom during the Victorian period. And the Duchess here does not experience any freedom under the Duke. He's trying to control her life, and when he can't, he has her killed. And so Browning's really critiquing these efforts. He felt that oppression. He and his wife had to elope. They couldn't marry in England because her father wouldn't let her marry. And so his father-in-law was very much an example of the Victorian efforts to control the instability they saw around them. An extreme example, since he wouldn't let any of his children marry. And so Browning's really critiquing that. I think he's also critiquing the patriarchal standards, the hypocritical uh, patriarchal double standards that did not give women independence and autonomy, because here the Duke is controlling, and the Duchess has no freedom, and she's even killed to ensure, the killing here is the ultimate form of control. And so Browning's really critiquing that, perhaps in casting the Duke as a villain, saying women should have more independence, more autonomy. And so in that sense, it ends up being this beautiful poem. It has to be ironic to be beautiful, but that's Browning's oddness and Browning's desire to make it a challenge for the reader and not tell things in a straightforward way. Which, again, depending on what you like with literature, some of us really appreciate that, some of us don't. Um, but it's kind of a romantic gesture, I think. His wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, wrote sonnets from the Portuguese, which are some beautiful sonnets that are dedicated to Robert Browning. And in his own kind of odd way, this seems like a dedication to her, a way of saying, um, I love you, you're great, women should have more rights, more freedom, that I'm going to use a guy who murdered his wife, but critique that guy in order to make that point. So it's very odd, it's very different, but I think in its own way, romantic and beautiful. The actual message, not what happens in the poem. Although the language is beautiful, that's part of the irony. Right, we're going to look at one last Browning poem before we move on. Child Roland to the Dark Tower Came. And I spelt the title wrong, I apologize. This is a poem that's always fascinated with me. I've read it multiple times. I've written essays on it, not good ones, tried to interpret it. But I'm going to take you through it and see what we can accomplish. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. The title is from a line from Shakespeare's play King Lear, where one of the heroes of the play, Edgar, is pretending to be insane in order to accomplish his goals, and he sings this song where he says the line, "Child, roll into the dark tower came." Well, what does it mean? A child is a young hero, a candidate for knighthood. So the reference in King Lear, as well as the title of this poem, both allude to the idea of a knight on a quest. And so you have a connection back to medieval times here. And the main character, Roland, the speaker of the poem, is trying to reach the Dark Tower. That's his quest. And so the poem tells the story of his journey. And I've broken it up into several parts, 6 parts to be exact, in order to help us interpret it. Now, this is my analysis. I should make that clear. Browning did not separate it into these parts, but I thought it would help us. So, part 1, it begins in media res, which is Latin for in the middle. In other words, Roland is already on his journey. We don't see the start of the journey, but he's paused, he's stopped, he's interacting with this cripple who's kind of a scary character. But after his interactions with the cripple, he decides to resume his journey. So that's our introduction. Rather than just starting the journey, we get in the middle, but we get the resuming of it. So it has kind of a feel of a beginning. This is a wasteland poem. It anticipates T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and other similar poems. And in that sense, it's similar to Blake's London. But the next set of stanzas, the speaker Roland is traveling through the wasteland. This is the most clear description of the wasteland. And it really seems like an example of environmental literature to me. The land is barren. The grass isn't growing. There's a disconnect between the humans and animals. Browning's depiction of the wasteland seems to be one that's particularly environmentally focused. And the next set of stanzas, there's kind of a pause where Roland thinks back to his the other knights, his friends who were knights. And so I call this like the medieval reverie, where he breaks in his journey and flashes back to earlier times. And these would seem like these could be happy times, but he then says at the start of stanza 18 in line 103, better this present than a past like that. And so he decides to push on. So he could idealize the past, even though he's in a wasteland. somehow making it through the wasteland, making it to the end of his journey and reaching the tower is better than that. So again, he resumes his journey. Then in port 4, he crosses a river filled with corpses. So I think this is just kind of a creepy part to continue to give the tone Browning wants to give of this being a wasteland. In part 5, we get more of an actual description of the wasteland again, and this time it has human beings in it. You see men fighting each other, you see men torturing each other, and I think the point here is human beings are the ones that ruin things. This is a wasteland because of what human beings have done. And finally, at the end, he does indeed reach the tower. Um, so let's talk a little bit about what all of this means. I can't go through it line by line, it's too long, but I've pulled out 3 quotes that I think are really important. In the second part, where he's crossing the wasteland and it seems like an example of environmental literature, he talks about seeing the devil's stud or horse, and he says, "Alive? He might be dead for aught I knew, with that red gaunt and colloped neck astrain, and shut eyes underneath the rusty mane. Seldom went such grotesqueness with such woe. I never saw a brute I hated so. He must be wicked to deserve such pain." So this is a very negative view of this horse. And I think that represents the fallen state of the wasteland. The wasteland representing the fallen world here. In other words, there's an unnatural distance between humans and animals. Roland should love a horse, but it's the devil's horse. It's corrupted. And so if you think back to John Clare in the Badger poem and that question we tried to answer of why badger baiting, the fallenness of the world, I think especially of the modern world is one that's moved in a direction of creating distance between humans and animals. We no longer exist side by side the way we used to. and that's unnatural. And so I think Browning's critiquing that like Clare does, and that's an example of how this poem in many ways is a work of environmental literature. I talked about how in part 5, when we get another thorough view of the wasteland, and this time humans are present, we see that humans are responsible for the fallenness of the world. So then came a bit of stubbed ground, once a wood, next a marsh it would seem, and now mere earth. Desperate and done with, so a fool finds mirth, makes a thing, and then mars it till his mood changes, and off he goes. Within a rude bog, clay and rubble, sand and stark black dearth. And um, so a fool finds mirth, but then makes it thing and mars it till his mood changes, and off he goes. So human beings are um, flighty individuals, were not consistent, and will ruin good things. And so he's in a wasteland. But what's caused it to be a wasteland? I think he's saying human beings. So this could also be an instance of environmental poetry. It also could fit with Browning's religious views. I should have mentioned this earlier, but unlike Tennyson and some of their other contemporaries, Matthew Arnold, who we'll study in a couple lessons, Browning didn't suffer from a crisis of faith the way they did. And he argued that heaven was perfect, and he depicts such awful things, murderers and other villains, a real rogues gallery. His claim was that the world is so imperfect that heaven must be perfect. And so, if the world is God's creation and it's fallen, it's ruined, humankind has ruined it, going back to Genesis 3, where Adam sinned. And so, you know, I think this poem really represents Browning's worldview in that sense, because we have a wasteland created by human beings. One last passage here. So, in the final set of stanzas, when he makes it to the dark tower, he references this great black bird, and this is an important passage. And just as far as ever from the end, not in the distance, but the evening not, to point my footstep further at the thought, a great blackbird, Apollonian's bosom friend, sailed past. Not best his wide-winged dragon penned that brushed my cap, perchance the guide I sought. And so one important thing I need to mention is this poem influenced Stephen King's Dark Tower series of novels. This is a very influential poem. A lot of people have mimicked it and given different versions of it, but if you're familiar with Stephen King and his Dark Tower series, which is this expansive series, it's very popular. Um, he based, the title character is, or the main character is Roland, and he based a lot of the imagery in it, especially in the first book, off of Browning's poem. And what's really significant is Roland in Stephen King's novel, that Roland goes through some training and has to face this enemy. And he has this, I think it's a raven, but this black bird he trains with. But he eventually has to sacrifice the bird in order to defeat his enemy. And so in Stephen King's book, hurting the environment or the natural world appears to be a rite of passage for men. And I think both authors critique this idea. I think Roland in that book shouldn't or doesn't want to kill the bird. And here, this bird, even though it's a bird that's associated with some evil or darker things, could be Roland's guide. And so it's a complicated relationship in both cases. And then my last question is this ultimately a work of hope or despair? It's read both ways. And so, again, like some of the other questions I've posed in this lesson, I think it could go either way. And critics have taken both sides, and I'm looking forward to reading what your side is. But I pose it as more of a question rather than just trying to give a statement, because I really do want to hear what you think. The argument for hope is that he does indeed reach the tower, but it ends there. You don't really see what happens once he reaches it. And the argument for despair is that he's crossing this wasteland. And so is this just a poem a nightmare, this fantastical vision, or is it about triumph and hope? And I like to, maybe I dare to be the optimist too much. I like to think he makes it to the tower. I like to think it's an optimistic work, but it's certainly a bleak, bleak poem in terms of the imagery. So again, look forward to hearing what you say. And I'll just close by saying there is one more poem by Browning, Love Among the Ruins, that I included. I didn't do a lecture on it, but I included it because I think it's just a beautiful poem. It's one of my favorite poems where you have this speaker in this old castle, and you have the contrast of this battle that was fought long ago with the speaker seeing his love come to the castle, and it ends up being kind of a twist where you think the poem is about this ancient battle, but it's really about romance. It's kind of a reverse twist from Porphyria's lover, and so it's very romantic in that sense. And it ends with the line, love is best. And so that's what I'll leave you with from this lecture. If you only remember one thing, love is best.